Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library, and I have a great story to tell you. Tonight, we're going to spend some time in the tranquility of the Broceliande forest in the company of characters you know, of King Arthur, his wife Guinevere, Merlin, Sir Lancelot, and Sir Galahad. We will discuss figures such as the Lady of the Lake and Morgan Le Fay, and delve into the legends of the Knights of the Round Table, Excalibur, Camelot, Avalon, and the quest for the Holy Grail. This mythology, which frequently appears in novels and films, is a fascinating aspect of culture. But where does it come from? Is it based solely on fiction, or is there some reality to it? How old is it, and why has it endured for so long? After all, these names I just mentioned were already famous 600 or 700 years ago in the Middle Ages. Tonight's discussion will include storytelling because we love stories, but will also touch on some history. We aim to understand what this Arthurian mythology is about by exploring regions and countries such as England, Wales, Scotland, and Brittany. Moreover, we'll travel back in time to the 5th century when the Roman Empire crumbled. To bring it all together, we will also delve into British and French literature and many other facets of Arthurian mythology. But first, I'd like to take 1 minute to let you know that we have a Patreon page for those of you who wish to and can support this project, get more of it, and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform that allows you to directly contribute to our work financially. If you join, you will get various new things, like the possibility to listen to all episodes with or without background sounds, and regular bonus episodes. We already have 3 episodes available only to our patrons, with the latest one being about the Library of Alexandria. You will be able to download all these audios, and you will have your say on the choice of topics. This topic was selected by our Patreons. We have advance releases and updates on upcoming episodes. We hope to see you there soon so that we may continue developing Lights Out Library, which we enjoy so much. You will find a link in the description box and the first comment pinned under the video. As always, you do not need to watch the video to follow along. If you wish, you may fall asleep and resume the video later, or jump directly to a particular part of the story, since we have timestamps listed in the description and pinned in the first comment, as well as links to different streaming options like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, which may be better suited for you. If you wish to, you may close your eyes and forget about any worries as we embark on this adventure together. But before we begin, assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath. When you exhale, release the tension in your shoulders, your neck. Feel your face soften and relax your jaw. Make sure your fingers are not clenched and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey to a world of legend and magic and history. Once upon a time, a long, long, long time ago, the island of Britain fell into chaos after the Roman Empire disappeared. Under the Romans, Britain was prosperous and safe. But with the empire gone, barbarian invasions began. Cities declined and villages were looted, and no part of the country remained safe. The Britons waited desperately for a savior, and then King Arthur of the Britons appeared. He led his army and his knights across the country to reestablish peace and restore authority upon the land. Then, with his gorgeous blonde wife, Guinevere, he ruled the new kingdom from his castle of Camelot. He was helped by Merlin the wizard and his Knights of the Round Table. Arthur was feared by his enemies and loved by his people. His knights were bound to him by their code of chivalry. Together they defeated the plans of the evil sorceress Morgana and even embarked on the ultimate quest for glory and faith, the search for the Holy Grail. Under these benevolent characters, the kingdom always remained safe despite countless events, internal and external threats, adventures, and magical romances. Arthur owned Excalibur, his legendary sword. According to some accounts, he pulled the sword from an anvil sitting atop a stone, and being the only one accepted by the sword, he gained legitimacy to be the one true king. In other versions, Excalibur was given to him by the Lady of the Lake, Vivien, an enchantress who was also the fairy godmother to Sir Lancelot and helped Merlin. As Arthur approached the end of his life, after he had been wounded by his traitorous nephew, Mordred, he was transported to the legendary island of Avalon, and nobody saw him again. There is speculation, though, that he could return one day. So, this is the tale, the legend. You may have heard it in this form or with the same characters playing different roles or with different sequences of events. This entire story has been elaborated and constructed over hundreds of years, and long after it ostensibly transpired. It originates from medieval treatises and novels written in England and France, beginning more than 1,000 years ago. Even if you are unfamiliar with King Arthur, you've probably recognized some elements because these stories act as a matrix for tales of chivalry, fairy tales, and fantasy narratives in general. Works written or created long after have employed the same archetypes and narrative patterns. Consider traditional fairy tales like Snow White, or works like The Lord of the Rings, or films like Indiana Jones and Star Wars. They all owe something to these Arthurian legends. So I will tell you more stories from them in a moment. First, though, let's examine Great Britain in the 5th century and the swath of literature that gave birth to this mythology, to discern what roots it might have in actual history, in real events. From the 1st to the 5th century, the Roman Empire occupied a significant portion of Great Britain, but not all of it. Scotland remained independent and was never occupied. First, because the Scots fiercely defended their land, and second, because it was far and not particularly strategic for Rome to occupy Scotland. So at some point at the beginning of the 2nd century, Rome agreed to establish its northern frontier close to what is currently the England-Scotland border. A long and famous fortification, a wall called Hadrian's Wall, named after Emperor Hadrian, was built, stretching from the North Sea to the Irish Sea. The efficacy of this wall as an adequate frontier was uncertain, because it was 80 miles long and impossible to fully garrison. The wall was never entirely invasion-proof, but that wasn't really the point. It reflected Rome's policy in the 2nd century of becoming more defensive, because the empire faced troubles in various parts of its vast territory, including far-off regions like Egypt. It was also a political construct, showcasing Rome's extraordinary wealth, engineering capabilities, and human resources. Speaking of wealth and engineering, Rome brought the occupied parts of Great Britain, England, and Wales an unprecedented level of security and prosperity for 4 centuries. The Roman influence ushered in roads, international trade, modern cities, and more land claimed for agriculture. Like many other parts of the Roman Empire, the living conditions for the population improved dramatically. People were mostly protected from raids. There were no civil wars. Everyday life improved for everyday social class, including the lowest ones like peasants. Troops were stationed consistently and were very efficient at deterring troubles or invasions. This lasted for generations, as seen in Gaul and Spain, until the Roman Empire, especially its western part, started to crumble and withdrew from its most distant provinces. In the 5th century, this is what happened to Great Britain. The Roman presence vanished. Britons found themselves an attractive prey to the so-called barbarians living around them. They were the Irish. Rome never conquered Ireland, and they started raiding the western coast of Great Britain regularly. From the north came the Scots and the Picts. To defend themselves, the Britons invited mercenaries, Saxon and Anglo mercenaries. These were Germanic tribes coming across the North Sea. However, this quickly backfired, and these mercenaries became invaders too, plunging most of Great Britain into complete chaos. This period marks the beginning of the Dark Ages, which is a period of several centuries that started with the fall of the Roman Empire in Western Europe. The same happened in Italy, in Spain, in France, and parts of Germany. The economy collapsed. Technology and knowledge were lost. Cities became much smaller. It is also likely that the population fell. Despite all these hardships, something happened in the 5th century. By the end of it, after several decades of chaos, the situation somewhat improved. A degree of peace was restored. This raises the possibility that a providential man, perhaps a Roman, perhaps a Briton, managed to bring back a bit of order. But we don't know precisely who or how. There are several candidates, and it could be one of them or a combination of them that provided the basis for the legendary King Arthur. There is no compelling evidence from the 5th century about this. As far as we know, the name Arthur appeared for the first time several centuries later in a Welsh poem from the beginning of the Middle Ages. This text was written by a monk at the beginning of the 1800s, so we are already 300 years later. The name Arthur is mentioned not as a king, but as a military leader who fought alongside the kings of the Britons. He is said to have guided an army in a series of victorious battles against the Saxons and forced them to retreat. Another theory is that Arthur was Roman. He might have been inspired by a man called Riothemus or Arthurius, who lived in Britain during this post-Roman period. This figure would also have fought against the invaders. It is well possible that a strong man, or several strong men, emerged at the end of the 5th century. But historians did not find any solid evidence to support this. Actually, in Britain, like many European countries, the 5th, 6th, and the 7th centuries are among the least well known, as the name Dark Ages suggests. These were chaotic centuries. By many counts, civilization receded. Few documents were written and many were lost. Massive waves of invasion destroyed a considerable amount of history. In Western Europe, scarcely any architectural traces remain due to an absence of major stone buildings being constructed. After the early 1800s, we know that the name of Arthur is mentioned in tales from Wales and Brittany, bringing us beyond Great Britain. Brittany, the westernmost region of France, wasn't part of the country during that time. It gained independence as a kingdom during the Middle Ages, subsequently became a duchy, and later joined the Kingdom of France. In these tales, Arthur is portrayed as a hero, a great warrior who defended Britain from an assortment of enemies, both human and supernatural. Remarkably, there's no known mention of other characters fighting alongside him. The true basis for Arthurian mythology, which genuinely established him as a recognized figure beyond these local stories, originates from a book from the 12th century. So this is another 300-year leap. And this time we are almost midway between Arthur's supposed time and today. The book is called Historia Regum Britanniae, translated as History of the Kings of Britain, written in Latin by Geoffrey Monmouth, a British cleric. No historian regards this book as a credible history source, attributing it as a fictional account of British history. The narrative begins with the mythical founding of the British nation by the Trojans, and lasts over 2,000 years until the Anglo-Saxons took control of most of Britain in the 7th century. Historia Regum Britanniae's value does not lie in its historical accuracy, given that considerable parts of it were fabricated or influenced by legends. However, as a piece of medieval literature, it is tremendously insightful. Besides the Arthurian legend, the book introduced another purely fictional character, King Lear. Today, King Lear is famed primarily because Shakespeare repurposed this mythical character. The history of the kings of Britain, despite being purely fictional, gained significant popularity in the 12th century. It was translated into various languages and was considered a serious historical text by many until the end of the Middle Ages. A popular book during these times didn't necessarily indicate widespread availability. Books were handwritten, primarily in monasteries, and were accessible only to a small population of educated monks, clerics, librarians, and nobles. Consequently, the definition of a successful book in the Middle Ages may have encompassed a few dozen copies and a few hundred to a few thousand readers. While it might not have permeated popular culture extensively, the most striking and memorable parts of history could trickle down, allowing tens of thousands of individuals to learn about it. In this fictional work, the author introduces King Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon. He claims that after the Romans abandoned Britain, the Britons sought a monarch who could defend them. The Archbishop of London reached out to the Kingdom of Brittany, trading the throne of Britain for the promise of protection for the Britons. The brother of the King of Brittany accepted. He became King of Britain and had 3 sons, the youngest of them, Uther Pendragon, father of King Arthur. This story is entirely fictional. The Kingdom of Britain did not exist in the 5th century. It was founded several centuries later. Consequently, this is entirely anachronistic. Furthermore, the characters are purely imaginative. However, this is the tale of how Arthur gained a father. Here's how the story unfolds. Uther Pendragon was merely the youngest son, so naturally he was not the heir. His elder brother claimed the throne first. Yet he was weak and allowed a burgeoning population of Saxons to settle in Britain, much to the detriment of the British populace. An increasing population of Saxons eventually seized the country's major cities, including London and York. Given the circumstances, the king was forced to retreat to Snowdonia in Wales, where he endeavored to construct a fortress. But the fortress could not be erected because stones continually sank into the ground. It seemed that the only resolution to lay the foundations of this fortress would require sprinkling the blood of a boy with no father on the stones. A boy with no father was a rare occurrence, but the king's envoys found one. Allegedly, he was conceived by a spirit, and his name was Merlin, marking the entry of the wizard in Arthurian Legends. Merlin was intelligent. He succeeded in avoiding the sacrifice by deciphering the problem of the sinking stones. Underneath the chosen site to build the fortress was an underground pool. Upon draining the pool, 2 dragons appeared, one white and one red. The dragons entered into combat. The white one signified the Saxons and the red one represented the Britons. And after being dominated, the red one, the Britons, finally prevailed. Merlin interpreted this event as a sign that Saxon dominance in Britain would be surmounted. Later on, the king met his ultimately death in a fire, and his brother was poisoned, leading Uther Pendragon, the youngest brother, to ascend to the throne. He persistently battled the Saxons during his entire reign. However, during a Gaul gathering in London, he was suddenly overwhelmed with an intense desire for the wife of the Duke of Cornwall, one of his vassals. In a desperate attempt, the Duke sent his wife back to Cornwall, anticipating that the king would not pursue her. Regardless, Uther was profoundly infatuated with her. When the Duke refused to hand over his wife, Uther boldly led his army into Cornwall. He overpowered the Duke's inferior forces and then consumed a potion crafted by Merlin, which transformed him into an exact replica of the Duke. He infiltrated the castle where the Duke's wife resided, deceiving her into believing he was her husband. She invited him to her bed, and on that night, Arthur was conceived. You understand why this book, History of the Kings of Britain, was such a big success. It is a great story. The part I told you about is only a small fragment of it. For readers 8 centuries ago, this was a wonderful epic, akin to The Lord of the Rings. But on top of this, it was supposed to be a historical account, and it seemed believable. Some people may have had their doubts and only half convinced, but this was a time when people believed in magic. They saw the supernatural in everything and had no way of verifying whether this was fiction or not, as there were no accessible historical resources. According to the book, King Uther was ultimately poisoned by the evil Saxons. However, they couldn't stop his son, Arthur, from being crowned. Arthur continued fighting the Saxons, allied with the Picts and the Scots, and finally defeated them all, ushering a period of peace and prosperity. He returned land to the rightful owners, initiated various construction projects, and was extraordinarily popular. People credited him for his courage and generosity. He married a woman of Roman descent, Guinevere. This marks her entrance into the story. The narrative continues when Arthur has secured his kingdom. From there, he ventures into Europe, conquers Norway, Denmark, and Gaul, and gathers knights from around him. Even though Rome still exists in this alternate reality, it threatens him because Britain no longer pays tribute. Arthur, refusing to yield, leads his army through Gaul and triumphs over the Romans in Burgundy. Next, Arthur plans to cross the Alps and advance towards Rome. However, he receives concerning news from home. Arthur had left his nephew, Mordred, in charge of the kingdom, but Mordred usurped the throne and began committing adultery with Guinevere. Arthur returns home, leading to a battle during which Mordred is killed and Arthur is fatally wounded. After the battle, he is taken to the mythical island of Avalon, and he never returns. So one might assume he died there. Or did he? The History of the Kings of Britain was published in 1136, and it laid the foundations of the literary King Arthur, introducing places, events, and a few characters. However, the legend was still far from becoming the tale we know today over the next 3 centuries. The evolution continued in France under the pen name of a poet named Chretien de Troyes. Chretien de Troyes has been called the inventor of the modern-day novel by some literary historians because he wrote stories that were potentially fictional and intended purely for entertainment. This is a basic concept in storytelling today. Yet prior to the 12th century, no novels as we understand them today had ever been penned. Stories recorded in chronicles, treatises, or essays, but the intent to write a book or just a short story purely for the sake of storytelling was not present during this period. Modern storytelling in novels means a story, no matter how long or short, follows a structure, a beginning, a build-up in the middle, a climax, and a conclusion. It forms a system and cannot end in the middle without resolving plot points. Unless this is intentional, we consider it incomplete or poor writing. Chretien de Troyes added new elements to this tale, building on the writings of Geoffrey Monmouth, the author of History of the Kings of Britain, and introduced several characters, including one of the most famous, Sir Lancelot. Lancelot, a brave and handsome knight, is sometimes weak when it comes to women. This weakness becomes evident when he starts an affair with Guinevere while he is in service to Arthur, creating a love triangle. In the history of the kings of Britain, Guinevere is already guilty of causing the kingdom to descend into civil war by aligning with Mordred. Once again, she threatens peace and her marriage with her affair. The portrayal of Guinevere varies depending on the author, where she's often seen as a threat or even a villain. This portrayal was not uncommon in medieval stories, especially in tales of chivalry, where a knight accomplishes extraordinary feats to win a lady's favor. Women were praised as long as they remained modest, beautiful, and loyal to their husbands and households. But when they deviated from this path, disaster ensued, not just for them, but for the entire society. In literature and popular stories, women were deemed dangerous. This reflects the myth of Adam and Eve, where Eve is responsible for the original sin and the fall of humanity. Similarly, it illustrates the heavily patriarchal society of the Middle Ages. These stories also served as cautionary tales. They were typically written by men primarily for a male audience. Fewer women than men had the education to read these tales. You could find some in the nobility or at the head of a monastery, but otherwise they would know about these stories only through oral storytelling or when they were adapted into the theater or songs. Chretien de Troyes' main addition is the quest for the Holy Grail, appearing in one of his later works, Percival, the Story of the Grail. He introduced the concept of a golden grail, which was a serving dish and not a goblet. Percival was raised by his mother in the forests of Wales. One day he encountered a group of knights and was inspired to become one himself. Consequently, he journeyed to King Arthur's court for training. During a visit to the forest where his mother lived, he met the Fisher King, the Wounded King, the last of a long line charged with guarding various artifacts, including the Holy Grail. He was unable to stand and could only fish in a small boat near his castle. The Golden Grail kept him alive as he awaited the one noble chosen to heal him. Unsurprisingly, this chosen one was Percival. In the original stories involving the Grail, Percival is the central character, and he joins all the knights around King Arthur's Round Table. However, in later French and English novels, he is replaced by another knight, Galahad. Like Geoffrey Monmouth, Chretien de Troyes was a successful author. This is known due to the dozens of copies of his writings that have survived until now. His stories were widely translated, enhanced by the popularity of Arthurian legends. A follower of Chretien de Troyes, Robert de Boron, introduced Broceliande, a mythical forest located somewhere in Britain. In one of his poems, Broceliande became the forest where Merlin was buried. In subsequent stories, Broceliande was presented as a place where the nefarious Morgan Le Fay trapped knights in the Valley of No Return until they were freed by Lancelot. Broceliande had a reputation as an enchanted forest before it was associated with Arthurian legend. In medieval Europe, it was regarded as a place of mystery and magic. Enchanted forests are a recurring theme in fantasy literature, with many novels featuring them. As such, Broceliande is considered the original literary deep forest of ancient times. While it doesn't have a specific location, the Pomponne Forest in Brittany has been often associated with Broceliande and started receiving tourists in the 19th century. Nowadays, there are neo-pagan circles that gather and perform ceremonies there. All of these texts became a major part of British and French literature around the 13th and 14th centuries, the equivalent of today's classics. They are a key part of what scholars call the matter of Britain and the matter of France. That is the foundational literature of both countries, which helped shape the national identities. It was during this period of the Middle Ages that authors started to write in their vernacular languages rather than in Latin. These works, which build the Arthurian mythology, were among the first works of fiction to be translated into other languages, broadening their reach. Another critical text of Arthurian literature is considered the first novel written in English, Le Mort d'Arthur. The title is in Middle French, meaning the death of Arthur. Though the text was written in Middle English, which deviates from the language spoken today, modern editions include an adapted form of English that makes it easier to understand. However, even in Middle English, despite its unusual spelling, can be understood by any English speaker. Le Mort d'Arthur was written in the 15th century, at the end of the Middle Ages, by Sir Thomas Malory. In a sense, it is the Bible of Arthurian legend, as it is a compilation and reworking of existing tales. Thomas Malory collated nearly everything that had been published since the 12th century, translated the French parts into English, and made a few additions. And unlike the manuscripts I mentioned before, this work was printed in 1485, shortly after it was written. With the advent of book printing in Europe at the end of the Middle Ages, successful books could be printed in their thousands, leading to a far wider distribution. The book consists of 8 different sections that trace Arthur's life from birth to his final battle, detailing dozens of side stories involving all characters, especially the Knights of the Round Table. Thomas Malory narrates how Arthur was born from Uther Pendragon, became king of Britain after he removed the sword from the stone, and accomplished military feats with Merlin's help. Morgan Le Fay, his sister, betrays him, as does his nephew Mordred. Arthur eventually marries Guinevere and inherits the Round Table from her father, creating a fellowship of knights that he gathers around the table. Many anachronistic elements are found in the text. The code of chivalry and the weapons and armors used by the knights, all contemporary with Sir Thomas Malory's times, clearly could not have existed 1,000 years prior. But the intent of the book is not to offer a factually accurate historical account, but rather to weave an engaging novel. That doesn't mean, however, that it is detached from its time frame. The book was written during the War of the Roses. Throughout the book, one observes a preoccupation with order and legitimacy, and the threats posed by those seeking to forcefully ascend to power. Once Arthur has established his kingdom, he conquers Rome and is crowned Roman emperor after defeating Roman armies. However, instead of remaining there, he returns to Britain. Among all his knights, the most revered is Lancelot. His behavior is flawless. He is supremely loyal and brave, always prepared to aid ladies in distress. Yet Lancelot grapples with his chivalric code and the convoluted reality where it's not always clear which action will serve the greater good. Bewitched by Morgan Le Fay and smitten by Guinevere, Lancelot eventually falters. As the narrative progresses, various knights, including Lancelot, Percival, and Bors, embark on a quest for the Holy Grail, which is finally completed by Galahad. Galahad embodies perfection and purity, living a sinless life of unwavering faith. This faith allows him to achieve the quest. Other knights, however virtuous, cannot attain this level of perfection that stems from faith, particularly Lancelot. Subsequently, Guinevere's affair is exposed, and Arthur sentences her to death by fire. Driven by love, Lancelot defies the rules, rescuing Guinevere while killing several knights in the process. He then flees to France. In Arthur's pursuit of Lancelot, Mordred seizes the throne and control of the kingdom. Arthur returns to Britain, participating in his final battle, where Mordred perishes. But Arthur is critically injured and taken aboard a boat with Excalibur, bound for Avalon. This constitutes just the central plot of Le Morte d'Arthur, which also entails numerous subplots and characters. The novel was a success and remains a pivotal reference for Arthurian mythology today, but was nearly forgotten by the end of the 16th century, as was King Arthur himself. So the Middle Ages concluded, and the ensuing era dismissed all things medieval. Chivalry vanished, the world expanded dramatically beyond Europe due to exploration, and medieval customs, architecture, and literature were largely overlooked or rejected for being supposedly naive and antiquated. These elements were generally perceived as remnants of a dark age. The contemporary audience interpreted these tales as a mixture of fiction and history. As I mentioned earlier, the history of the kings of Britain was often taken as a history book in those times. By the 16th and 17th centuries, it had become clear that these stories were not reliable historical accounts. When historians reassessed and acknowledged the inaccuracy of the writings of Geoffrey, Monmouth, Chretien de Troyes, and Thomas Malory, the esteem of these books receded further. The Arthurian legend was not entirely forgotten, but its audience shrank, and its influence barely extended outside Britain, despite having been a European phenomenon from the 12th to the 15th century. This continued until the 19th century, when medieval culture, Romanticism, and the Gothic revival reignited interest. During the 19th century, this mythology regained popularity and provided inspiration for successful novels. La Morte d'Arthur was republished and reestablished as a classic. The legend spurred artistic creativity in paintings and significantly influenced fantasy literature up to the present day, as well as films. Today, figures such as Arthur, Merlin, Excalibur, and Lancelot are universally recognized, largely thanks to this revival. After enduring centuries of development and having roots grounded in a real era, Arthurian mythology has acquired a singular aspect, even though King Arthur might be a fictitious character. Modern fantasy novels like The Lord of the Rings or A Song of Ice and Fire may be enthralling, yet we can't disregard the fact that they are purely fictional. Due to its longevity and historical rooting, Arthurian mythology occupies its own exceptional space. This mythology, despite its fictional nature, bears ties to real history. We've come to the end of our little journey tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to discover and learn more. Now you can let go and sleep. Or, if you're not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.